Lisa and Kevin Graham had made a good life for themselves.
We was planning on retiring when we hit 50.
And they had 2 children together.
There ain't nothing no better than raising a child.
But then their daughter went missing.
Mama was calling all her buddies riding around looking for her.
And it was the police who found her.
We could see several gunshot wounds.
This was certainly an execution-style murder.
The investigation would expose all their daughter's secrets.
Shay was not an angel by any means.
She was doing cocaine, she was stripping.
And it would end in a revelation so unexpected that no one saw it coming.
I loved my daughter.
It floored all of us.
I don't think I was ever so shocked.
Phoenix City, Alabama, July 5th, 2007. It was a Thursday night in this quiet town of 30,000 just across the Georgia state line.
Phoenix City is a mid-sized town. It's pretty laid back. Very friendly folks live there.
In fact, Phoenix City is normally so quiet and laid back that at a little after 11 that night, when a truck driver on his way to work spotted something lying on the side of the road, he automatically assumed that it was no big deal.
When he passed it originally, he thought it was just a deer or something.
A lot of deer in that area get hit.
But as he got closer, he realized that the bloody corpse on the roadside wasn't a deer. Instead, it was far worse.
He called the Russ County Sheriff's Office and said there's a dead body.
Sheriff's deputies were on the scene within minutes.
When we arrived on the scene, the victim's body was laying partially on the road, but mostly off of a dirt road.
But the lifeless victim, a young woman, hadn't been struck by a car.
We could see several gunshot wounds.
It appeared that she'd been shot and left to die on the side of the road.
This was certainly an execution-style murder.
We didn't see any other wounds. We didn't see anything that indicated she'd been beat up or any defensive type wounds.
However, they did find indications of something else.
She had her underwear down around her ankles.
We thought that it could possibly be some form of a sexual assault.
And then, after being raped, shot, and left on the side of the road, she'd suffered one final indignity as her killers fled the scene.
There were tread marks on her body where she had been ran over by a vehicle.
But since she had no ID, the investigators had no idea who the young woman was.
There were some tattoos on her, and we were in the process of trying to ID who our victim was.
But even as they tried to identify the young woman who'd apparently been murdered along a remote stretch of road, 39-year-old Lisa Graham and her husband Kevin were frantically searching for their missing daughter. Lisa Carpenter was born in 1967.
She was the prettiest little thing, bald-headed, weighed 6 pounds and 5 ounces.
Her mother was only 17, and her parents split up before she was born.
Lisa's father never saw her, and he never had anything to do with her.
Despite that, she had a happy childhood growing up in Phoenix City.
She liked to go bowling and movies and stuff like that with her friends. Lisa had just a lot of friends in school.
One of those friends was a neighborhood boy named Kevin Graham.
I was 11 years old when I met Lisa, and she was 9.
Despite the difference in their ages, the pair became close.
We played a lot when we was growing up. We hung out through our teenagers' years. We went to the movies.
And one day, while the two friends were still in high school, Lisa decided she wanted to do more than just hang out.
I was working on my car in front of the house, and she rode by like 10 times, and finally she stopped and says, "Hey, are we going out or not?"
The former childhood playmates started dating. Kevin graduated and took a factory job. And soon after, once Lisa graduated, they moved in together.
Me and Lisa really got serious about when I was 19, 20.
And in 1986, when he was 21 and she was 18, they married.
We were sitting around the house, and I said, "Why don't we go get married?" And she said, "Okay." So I went to the courthouse, got married, come back home, had a ham sandwich for lunch and watched TV the rest of the day.
It may not have been the most romantic proposal and wedding, but the couple was happy and in love. And within a few months, Lisa was pregnant.
Kevin was very excited about having a baby, and when Lisa's stomach got really big, he would talk to the baby, and he was just so thrilled.
And when Lisa gave birth to their daughter Shay in February of 1987, Kevin went from thrilled to ecstatic.
There ain't nothing no better than raising a child.
Shay was beautiful. Oh, she was the most beautiful girl.
However, it was also a wake-up call for Kevin. With a family to provide for, he quit his dead-end job and started building a future.
I took the builder's test, got my builder's license, and that's how I started.
It was a big gamble, giving up a steady paycheck to start his own business. But Lisa did everything she could to support him, despite having a new baby at home.
Lisa did the office work in the office at the house.
She handled all the books, she handled all the calls that come in.
It was tough going at first.
The first year or 2 years I was in business, I may have built 7, 8 houses.
But the company grew, and so did their daughter.
She was a sweet little girl. She was adventuresome.
When she got up older, she became a tomboy.
She wasn't scared of anything.
In fact, she was hell on wheels.
I got her a go-kart when she was like 3. She rode it till it fell apart.
By the time she was a teen, Shay had a baby brother.
She was about 13 whenever I was born.
And soon after, she graduated from a go-kart to a full-fledged race car.
When Shay was 14, she was racing cars at East Alabama Motor Speedway.
She got into racing at the dirt track, and she got pretty good at it.
Meanwhile, her mother had her hands full, juggling the business and Shay's baby brother.
My memories of growing up with her was she was always working with the computers and all, signing checks, and I could always go in there and love on her, and she'd take breaks every now and again, spend time with me. And I became a mama's boy. I was constantly with her.
Then the housing market boomed, and so did the family's construction business.
I was building a house a week.
And by 2006, when the market was at its peak, it looked as if Lisa and Kevin's long hours and hard work would finally pay off.
We was planning on retiring when we hit 50.
But instead, it would all come crashing down in a murder that shattered Lisa's hopes and left Shay's secrets exposed. Coming up, Shay goes missing.
They were calling all of our buddies, riding around looking for her.
And the investigators search for a killer.
On that tape, Shay leaves with you.
Early on the morning of July 6, 2007, investigators from the Russell County Sheriff's Office had a mystery on their hands. At a little before midnight, a truck driver had called 911 and reported finding a dead body alongside the road outside Phoenix City, Alabama.
It was, as he described, a white female in a nude type condition, that her shirt was pulled up, she had on shorts, and her underwear were pulled down to about her ankles.
The young woman had no ID, and she'd been shot multiple times.
What's a young girl doing laying basically naked in the middle of the road at midnight?
One sickening possibility came to mind.
We thought it was sexually motivated or sexual assault case.
Although a final determination would require an autopsy.
We requested a sexual assault examination be done, a rape kit exam.
They also hoped that the autopsy could provide a clue about the victim's identity. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, Lisa and Kevin Graham were worried about their daughter.
I got up the next morning to go to work, and Shay's truck wasn't there, and she wasn't there.
Kevin and Lisa had both spent the day desperately trying to locate her.
They were calling all of our buddies, riding around looking for her.
And by that evening, Lisa had contacted the sheriff's office to file a missing persons report.
She said her daughter had not come home.
Had the investigators just found her, murdered along the side of the road?
We had a young white female, and we were able to put the 2 and 2 together.
But while sheriff's deputies suspected that their Jane Doe was Shay, They weren't about to tell Lisa and Kevin over the phone.
We asked them to come to the sheriff's office.
Kevin figured the news wasn't good.
I was assuming it was about Shay being in a wreck or, something happening.
But when he and Lisa arrived at the sheriff's office, the news was even more shocking than they imagined.
We heard back from the forensics people that the fingerprints had matched.
They told us that night that she'd been murdered.
Shay's parents broke down at the news, especially Lisa.
She fell all to pieces, crying upset.
Their daughter was dead, and the investigators had no suspects.
They didn't have no idea who done it, why they done it, or what happened.
They did, however, know one thing that didn't happen.
We had determined at this point from the post-mortem exam that there appeared to be no sign of sexual assault.
Which left the investigators wondering, had someone attempted to assault her? Had they tried to make it look like a sexual assault? Or was there some other explanation for why she'd been found with her pants pulled down?
Seems strange considering the way we found the body, and it kind of threw another curve in there.
For the moment, all the investigators knew for sure was the kind of gun that had been used to kill Shay.
The casings that we found on the crime scene were 9mm.
However, that wasn't all they had to go on, because there was a reason that the authorities already had Shay's fingerprints on file.
Shay had a history of drug charges.
A dirt track racer who'd started before she could legally drive, Shay had always been a little wild.
I can't tell you how many times I stopped Shay for riding her four-wheeler on the road.
But that was hardly the only trouble Shay got into as a teen.
Shay was not an angel by any means.
Shay got with the wrong crowd.
And Shay was barely in her teens before she picked up some very adult habits.
Shay was doing drugs when she was 13, 14, 15.
Before long, Shay's teenage drug habit had led to her first arrest and landed her in juvenile court.
She had to go see a judge twice a week, and that straightened her out for a while.
She was trying to get away from that crowd.
And in 2005, with Lisa's encouragement, Shay had even gone to college.
She didn't want a dead end of life.
But just as it looked like Shay was putting her rebellious past behind her, she fell back in with her old crowd and old habits, dropped out of college, and took a job at a local gentleman's club.
She was dancing, stripping, those types of things.
Lisa was bitterly disappointed in her daughter.
The crowd that Shay run with, Lisa didn't approve of it.
And as the investigators soon discovered, Lisa was right to worry about the crowd her daughter ran with.
Shay was involved in a drive-by shooting.
The incident had occurred in September of 2006, and Shay, who was 19 at the time, hadn't been the shooter.
She was driving when they started shooting.
And while no one had been seriously injured, Shay had been arrested.
She went to jail, and I went down there the next day and bonded her out.
He bonded her out and put up $100,000 cash of his and Lisa's money.
But now, not quite a year later, the investigators couldn't help but wonder, was Shay's murder somehow related to the drive-by?
She was due to go to court on that Friday after she was murdered.
Was it payback for her part in the shooting? The investigators weren't sure, but after informing her devastated mother and father that Shay was dead, they started trying to piece together where she'd been the night before.
They got information from several young people that had been in the company of Shay Graham.
And it eventually wound up with she was with a group of her friends.
According to her friends, they had all been hanging out on the night of the murder when, at around 10 o'clock, Shay's phone rang.
Shay had got a phone call from someone. She told them that she had some business to take care of and that she was going to meet this guy.
Shay's friends told the investigators that they last saw Shay when they dropped her off at a convenience store, where she got into a truck with someone and drove away.
They didn't know where they were going.
But one of Shay's friends did know the name of the man she'd met up with, 36-year-old Kenneth Walton.
Kenny Walton was a close friend of the Graham family. He worked for them.
I met him at the racetrack. I gave him a job cleaning up the houses after I got through building them, cleaning up the job sites. And he worked for me for a long time.
But Kenny no longer worked for Shay's father.
He totaled the dump truck out in the shop yard, and I fired him.
Could Shay's death be payback? It seemed possible, especially since Kevin had fired Kenny just 2 days before the murder.
When I fired Kenny, we got an altercation in front of the shop. It was really bad.
Or was there another reason Kenny might have killed Shay? Because as it turned out, the sheriff's deputies knew Kenny pretty well, too.
Kenny was a known enforcer for different drug dealers.
And he'd been in and out of jail on several occasions. The firing and his police record made Kenny a person of interest. But could the investigators prove he'd been with Shay on the night of her murder?
We went to get video from the gas station, of course.
We saw Kenny there, and so we felt like that at that point, Kenny Walton was the last person that she had been seen with alive.
And the phone records provided even more proof that Shay had left with Kenny.
She's texting all the way out to where we find the body.
The investigators were all but convinced they'd found Shay's killer. But when they brought him in on the afternoon of July 7th, he denied having anything to do with it.
She's like a daughter to me.
However, he did admit to meeting up with her on the evening of the 5th, but he told the investigators that he'd left alone.
She pulled up. She asked me, can she borrow my truck? I said, to do what? She said, I just need to borrow your truck. I told her no because my insurance don't cover her.
But the investigators knew he was lying.
On that tape, Shay leaves with you.
Incredibly, despite the video, Kenny still tried to deny it.
You didn't see me and Shay. The only person left in that truck with me was me. Shay didn't get in my truck, period.
Kenny could deny it all he wanted, but the investigators weren't buying it.
You know that whenever we make phone calls, there's a record.
I was able to show Kenny that he needed to tell the truth and tell his side of the story.
And so all of a sudden, the house of cards starts to crumble. And he finally breaks down and says, all right, this is what happened.
I'm going to tell you the truth. Okay.
Kenny told the investigators that Shay had contacted him a few weeks earlier about her upcoming court date and asked him to find a car for her.
She tells Kenny, I'm not going to court on this. I'm going to skip bond.
According to Kenny, that's why Shay met up with him that night at the convenience store.
He takes her out under the pretense of finding her a car.
But there was no car. Instead, Kenny told the investigators that he'd driven Shay out to the remote stretch of road where they'd found her body and killed her.
I got him on that shot.
Kenny had just admitted to the murder. But why would he kill Shay? Had an attempted sexual assault turned deadly? Not according to Kenny. He gave the investigators an entirely different explanation for why Shay's pants had been pulled down when the investigators found her body.
That Shay got out of the car to use the bathroom.
And according to Kenny, it was while Shay was in that extremely vulnerable position that he'd made his move.
She was taking the lead. I grabbed the pistol. I shot her.
She falls to the ground. He gets out, walks around the truck, and shoots her 3 or 4 more times.
Based on what the investigators already knew about the crime, Kenny's confession appeared genuine.
I'm telling you the truth.
But as it turned out, Kenny was just getting started. Coming up, Kenny makes an accusation against Shay's mom.
It floored all of us.
But how will Lisa respond?
And I said, Kenny, I don't know what else to do.
By July 7, 2007, it had been less than 48 hours since Lisa Graham's daughter, Shay, had been found dead on a roadside in Phoenix City, Alabama.
She had several gunshot wounds to her body.
But 36-year-old Kenny Walton, a friend and former employee of the Grahams, had just confessed to killing the 20-year-old.
She failed. I got out of the truck, and I remember shooting 2 or 3 more times.
Kenny's confession was welcome news to the sheriff and investigators outside who were watching on closed-circuit television.
I'm elated. Sheriff Taylor, he's like, yes. And he says, contact the Grahams and let them know that we've got the man who killed their child.
But inside the interview room, Kenny Walton was still talking.
We started getting into why. What was the motive?
And he kind of drops his head down and he says, well, I may as well tell you the rest of the story.
I know that you're not going to believe me.
I'm like, what the hell is he talking about? What is the rest of the story?
According to Kenny, the rest of the story was something so shocking that it took everyone by surprise.
He said, Lisa Graham hired me to kill Shay.
It was like a bomb going off. Like we had to stop the interview because we were all looking at each other.
Lisa, the mother, asked you. Miss Graham spoke to me, and she said it several times. Will you do me a favor? That was the favor. Kill Shay?
I don't think I was ever so shocked.
At that point of the investigation, we had not even fathomed that she was involved in her daughter's killing. When he brought that up, I mean, it floored all of us.
I was just shocked that a mother would hire someone to kill their child.
And as unbelievable as that was, Kenny claimed that Lisa had provided the murder weapon too.
She called me and told me to come to the library. I go to the library.
She walks in, she tells him the gun is on the floorboard of my truck in the parking lot.
I get the gun out and I take the gun and I put it in my truck.
And I said, well, Kenny, where's the gun now? I gave it back to her.
She was supposed to give me some money. How much? She didn't ever say. She told me if I needed anything to let her know.
But why would Lisa want her daughter dead? According to Kenny, it had to do with Shay's arrest for her involvement in a drive-by shooting.
She had on a $100,000 bond. I think it was the money thing. Court date coming up.
Lisa and Kevin had put up the money.
That was a good chunk of our retirement being put out there in a cash bond.
But according to what Kenny had told the investigators, Shay planned to skip town rather than appear for her court date, which would have had disastrous repercussions for her parents.
They were going to lose that money.
And according to Kenny, that's why Lisa asked him to kill Shay and leave her body on the side of the road.
He stated that Lisa had actually talked about not hiding the body. She was due in court the next morning. They would have lost their $100,000 whether she was dead or not if they couldn't find the body.
It was an amazing story, one that fit all the facts that the investigators knew. But was it true? Or was Kenny, who had an extensive criminal record, simply offering up Lisa in hopes of getting out of the mess he was in?
We absolutely didn't believe that Kenny was telling the truth.
So they decided to put his story to the test.
Do you feel comfortable with talking to Lisa?
They had Kenny Walton make a call from the sheriff's department to Lisa Graham at her home.
Hey, Miss Graham. How you doing? When I come down here to the jail,
the purpose of the call was to get her reaction to what Walton was going to say.
Can you get me a lawyer or help me out in any kind of way, since I did that favor for you? State money.
Lisa's response wasn't caught on the interrogation room tape, but detectives were listening. And Lisa didn't hang up, not even when Kenny started talking to her like a co-conspirator.
Did you do what I asked you to do about the gun? I need you to do that.
Her reactions on the phone, I think, solidified the opinion of the investigators.
And as soon as they could get a warrant, the investigators descended on the Graham's home.
We knew the caliber that we were looking for was 9mm, so we started asking Kevin specifically about 9mm pistols, and he says, yes, he has one and Lisa has one.
But when they opened the couple's gun safe, only Kevin's pistol was there.
She don't know where it's at, don't know what happened to it.
The gun wasn't in her car either.
So we asked Kevin, if the gun's not in the car, where would it be? And he said, at Papa's house.
Kevin calls him on the phone and he says, yes, that Lisa had given him the gun.
She had given it to Papa and told him to clean it.
But he hadn't done it yet, as the investigators discovered when they examined the gun.
There's obvious tissue matter on the barrel. We're like, okay, we got the murder weapon.
And by morning, the investigators had ushered Lisa into an interview room at the Russell County Sheriff's Office.
I want you to be honest with me about it. And if you are honest with me about it, that's going to help you as well.
We've got his confession, we've got the gun, we have sufficient probable cause to get warrants for Lisa Graham.
But did they have the whole story? In her interview, Lisa began by talking about the troubled relationship she had with her daughter.
She was doing cocaine. She was stripping.
She just got with the wrong crowd and just things went downhill.
We paid to put her in college. She went two quarters, dropped out.
But according to Lisa, Shay's father hadn't shared her frustration.
He wouldn't help me do nothing with her. Every time I brought her name up, I was picking on her.
They were constantly fussing, arguing almost every day.
And Lisa said the fact that Kevin often sided with Shay was why she had turned to Kenny. But instead of asking him to kill her, Lisa said she'd merely asked Kenny to go to the strip club and talk to her daughter.
He tried to help me with Shay. He would go up there and he would talk to her. He would tell her, Shay, you don't need to strip.
In return, Lisa said she tried to help Kenny with his problems, and she claimed that was why they met up at the library a few hours before Shay's murder.
She said that Kenny was having problems with his wife, and he was estranged, and she was trying to coach him on that.
But eventually, the conversation had turned to Shay.
I told Kenny, I said, I can't take it no more. I don't know what to do.
Lisa Graham was very frustrated with her daughter's drug activity. She was always getting in trouble.
And according to Lisa, that was when Kenny stepped up.
He looked at me, and I'm telling you the truth, and he looked at me and he was dead serious. And he said to me, he said, I know what to do. I know what to do to solve the whole problem.
And what was Kenny's solution?
Kenny said the only thing I know to do is get rid of her.
Lisa said it was Kenny who'd first brought up killing Shay. But according to Lisa, the whole thing sounded so ridiculous that she had assumed Kenny was joking.
She says, I may have told him to do that, but I didn't mean it.
And you said, okay, do it.
And I said, Kenny, I don't know what else to do. I've done everything I know to do.
But according to Lisa, she never really wanted her daughter dead, not for a minute.
She says that it was all a misunderstanding.
You just didn't know that it was going to go all the way through is what you're trying to say.
Right. I had no idea. And I had no idea that...
But you said it.
Yeah.
She may have said it, but according to Lisa, she was as surprised as anyone when Shay had been killed.
I really thought he really didn't mean it. And nothing
was going to happen.
Honest to God.
She was telling the sheriff, you know me. You know I wouldn't do anything like this.
I loved my daughter.
I think you probably do or did.
But even if that was true, Lisa still had a big problem. How did Kenny get her gun?
She says he wanted the gun for some business.
Business that Lisa insisted did not include killing Shay.
I did not tell Kenny to kill my child. That's the point that I can't make everybody understand.
Or did the investigators understand exactly what Lisa was doing?
She was obfuscating, deflecting blame.
And they had heard enough.
We decided to go ahead and charge her with the capital murder.
Coming up, can the prosecution prove it was murder for hire?
There was never any money that was transferred.
Or will a surprise witness tip the scales?
She says, I want the little bitch dead.
On February 25, 2015, Lisa Graham went on trial for murder in Phoenix City, Alabama. The 47-year-old was charged with masterminding the 2007 death of her daughter, Shay.
What brings you to the point where you give someone your own gun to shoot and kill your own daughter?
It had been 8 years since Shay Graham had been killed, but the trial had been delayed again and again, first by courthouse renovations.
That was 2.5 years that we were out of the courthouse.
And then because the original presiding judge stepped down.
He was diabetic and had some very serious health issues.
Lisa spent the last 2 years of the delay out of jail on a $250,000 bond.
It took cash money to do it, and a lot of people went to bat for her.
Although Lisa's husband wasn't one of them.
At this point in time, in 5 years, I'm fully convinced that she done it.
But could the prosecutors convince a jury? After all, their key witness was the man who'd confessed to pulling the trigger, Kenneth Walton.
Kenny Walton was a cold-blooded murderer, and I was going to ask them to believe some things that he said.
And then there was Lisa's so-called confession.
He said the only thing I know to do is get rid of her.
Okay.
Okay.
And you said, okay, do it.
And I said, Kenny, I don't know what else to do.
It was never, yes, I did it. It was, well, I didn't really mean to do it. I did talk to him about it, but I wasn't serious.
But the prosecutors believed that she had meant it. And if a jury agreed, the consequences for Lisa would be serious.
Because it's a death penalty case.
It was what she deserved, according to the prosecution's opening statement. They said that Lisa had her own daughter killed for an astoundingly selfish reason.
The prosecution's take was that Lisa Graham hired a hitman to kill her own daughter, to relieve herself of the frustration of dealing with Shay's drug problem.
They'd spent money for lawyers and drug rehab.
And in September of 2006, Lisa and her husband had shelled out another huge chunk of cash when Shay was arrested after a drive-by shooting incident.
The very last straw that broke the camel's back was when she was out on the $100,000 bond.
Lisa kept saying that Shay was going to run and jump bond, and I was going to lose the money.
That was the moment that Lisa snaps and says, no, I'm not losing any more money on this child, and decides that they have to kill her.
In his opening, however, Lisa's attorney stuck to her original story, that it was all a huge misunderstanding.
She did not ask him to kill her daughter. She did a lot of complaining about her daughter. Kenneth Walton, he took that complaining as, hey, go kill my daughter.
But was that really what happened? When the prosecutors started laying out their case, They claim that Lisa had not only asked Kenny to kill Shay, they said he wasn't even the first person she'd approached.
There were people that came forward in this investigation that said that Lisa had asked them to kill Shay.
In fact, according to the prosecution, she'd done more than just ask.
That Lisa had offered them money to kill Shay.
One of them, a neighbor of Lisa and Kevin's, took the stand and testified about an incident a couple of months before Shay's murder.
Shay was chasing her boyfriend around with a knife, so I walked to Lisa and Kevin's house and knocked on their back door to let them know they needed to get Shay under control before the police were called.
According to the neighbor, while Kevin went to deal with Shay, Lisa had approached him with a startling proposition.
She would pay me $5,000 to kill Shay. And I told her she was nuts. I said, you can't get away with it. She says, I want the little bitch dead.
Despite Lisa's anger, the neighbor hadn't taken her seriously.
I thought she was venting.
When she would lose her temper and she would say wild stuff about killing somebody or hurting them.
But then Shay really had been murdered.
Then I knew she really meant it.
According to the prosecution, once she'd made up her mind, all Lisa needed was someone willing to do it. And they put that someone, Kenny Walton, on the stand to explain just how Lisa had asked him to kill.
He wasn't the best witness, but we had to have his testimony.
But would the jury take the word of an admitted killer with an extensive criminal record?
The defense tried to paint Kenny Walton as a liar. They said to him, you're trying to save yourself by turning evidence against her.
He threw my mama under the bus in order to lessen his sentence.
He would not get the electric chair if he confessed.
And the defense's pressure may have paid off. During cross-examination, Kenny did admit one key point that the defense hammered on repeatedly.
There was never any type of money that was transferred from Lisa to Kenny Walton.
Their contention is that we didn't prove that there was a murder for hire.
And in closing, the defense stood by their claim that while Lisa may have said she wanted Shay dead, she had never, ever meant it.
It was something that she casually said all the time.
Just running her mouth, blowing off steam. It doesn't mean anything.
But would the jury agree? When the jurors retired to consider their verdict on March 4th, 2015, Lisa's hopes came down to one thing, and one thing alone.
The average juror wouldn't want to believe that a mother killed her own child.
It's just inconceivable. The most absurd, bizarre, unthinkable, unimaginable thing that could ever happen.
Coming up, the jury struggles to reach a verdict.
They deliberated for hours.
But what will their decision be?
Sad doesn't start to cover it.
On March 5th, 2015, almost 8 years after her arrest, the jury had reached a verdict in the trial of Lisa Graham. The 47-year-old was accused of masterminding the 2007 murder of her daughter, Shay. And if the jury found her guilty, Lisa faced a possible death sentence.
Hiring someone to kill another person. Under Alabama law, that's a capital offense.
But would the jury be willing to put her to death? Especially since the man she'd allegedly hired, Kenny Walton, had testified against Lisa at trial in exchange for a sentence of life with the possibility of parole.
It's difficult for some people to look at the facts and say, well, you let the guy who shot this young woman, shot her 5 times, you let him get life, but you want death for the mother.
It may have been difficult for the jury, too.
They deliberated for hours, upon hours. You're trying to figure out, what are they thinking?
Lisa thought she knew.
It's like, I'm gonna walk right out of here.
But then the verdict was announced.
The jury's decision was to find her guilty.
Lisa turned kind of pale, and then her face turned really red. And when her face turned really red, you knew she was really angry.
I think that she felt that she was not going to be found guilty.
And that wasn't even the worst news for Lisa.
The jury voted 10-2 to recommend the death penalty.
At the sentencing hearing 8 months later, Lisa's 17-year-old son asked the judge to show mercy.
I just simply asked him, how would you feel if it was your mom?
Would her son's plea be enough for the judge to go against the jury's recommendation?
The judge sentenced her to death.
For some, the outcome was a travesty.
How that jury let the guy that put bullets in my granddaughter walk away with life in prison.
But for others, it was justice.
She got what she asked for, the death penalty.
Although Shay's father, who filed for divorce from Lisa, isn't satisfied with a death sentence.
She'll be on death row for 20, 30 years. And that ain't nothing.
Because Lisa stands convicted of a crime so diabolical that it's almost unthinkable.
A situation where someone contracted for someone else to murder their own biological child. It's sad doesn't start to cover it.
This is by far the worst case that I have ever witnessed.
They say the devil takes form and walks the earth, and I've always said that's Lisa Graham.
On October 26, 1965, a 16-year-old girl named Sylvia Marie Likens died inside a house on East New York Street in Indianapolis, Indiana. She had not been discovered in some isolated place, far from help, or after a sudden encounter with a stranger. She was inside the home of a woman who had been entrusted with her care. That woman was Gertrude Banaszewski, a divorced mother responsible for several children. For roughly 3 months, Sylvia had been subjected to escalating abuse inside that house, until her condition became critical and she could no longer survive. When police arrived, they found Sylvia's body upstairs. The medical findings would reveal a pattern of injuries that could not be explained by a single violent incident. Sylvia had suffered a subdural hematoma resulting from a blow to the head, along with shock and severe malnutrition. Her injuries existed at different stages, indicating that what had happened to her had developed over time. The case that followed would become one of the most disturbing murder investigations in Indiana, not only because of Sylvia's death, but because of the circumstances that had preceded it. The person responsible for caring for Sylvia had not protected her. Instead, Gertrude Banaszewski had become the central figure in a prolonged pattern of abuse, while several of her children and other neighborhood juveniles also became involved. To understand how Sylvia came to die in that house, however, the story has to begin before the violence, before the arrests, and before investigators knew what had happened. It begins with a 16-year-old girl whose family circumstances brought her to Indianapolis in the summer of 1965. Sylvia Marie Likens was born on January 3, 1949, in Lebanon, Indiana. In 1965, she was 16 years old. Her sister Jenny was 15. Their parents, Lester and Betty Likens, worked in connection with traveling fairs and frequently had to move from place to place. Because of their work and the periods when they were away, arrangements had to be made for Sylvia and Jenny to stay somewhere else. That arrangement brought the two girls into the Banaszewski household on East New York Street in Indianapolis. Gertrude Banaszewski was a divorced mother raising several children. The arrangement appeared straightforward. Sylvia and Jenny would remain at the Banaszewski home while their parents were away, and the Likens family would provide weekly payment for their care. It was an ordinary kind of arrangement, built on the expectation that an adult would provide supervision and safety to two teenage girls. At first, Sylvia and Jenny lived with the Banaszewski family relatively normally. There was no indication at the beginning that Sylvia would never return to her family. But the circumstances inside the house gradually changed. The payments from the Likens family began arriving irregularly, and this became a growing source of tension. Gertrude was already living under difficult circumstances and was responsible for several children. As the financial arrangement became strained, her anger increasingly turned towards Sylvia and Jenny. What began as tension eventually developed into physical punishment. Then the punishment became more severe. Sylvia, in particular, became the principal target. The supplied facts do not provide a single reasonable explanation for why Sylvia was ultimately singled out to such an extreme degree. Instead, they describe a gradual transformation in the way she was treated. Gertrude and children around her began circulating accusations about Sylvia. Some of these accusations concerned sexual and moral behavior, but the available information indicates that they had no credible foundation. Nevertheless, those accusations became a justification for treating Sylvia as though she deserved punishment. The distinction between punishment and abuse began to disappear. Sylvia was beaten for increasingly minor reasons. Her normal life outside the house was taken away. Eventually, she was no longer permitted to attend school. She was kept inside the home and later confined in the basement area. At that point, Sylvia was no longer simply a teenager staying temporarily with another family. She had become isolated from ordinary life and increasingly dependent upon the very people who were harming her. The abuse also began to expand beyond Gertrude herself. Several of Gertrude's children and other juveniles from the neighborhood became involved. Among those later prosecuted were Paula Banaszewski, Gertrude's daughter, John Banaszewski Jr., her son, Richard Hobbs, who was 15, and Coy Hubbard, also 15. Another of Gertrude's children, Stephanie Banaszewski, was arrested as well, but later cooperated with prosecutors and became a witness. The presence of these young people changed the nature of what was happening inside the house. The abuse had become a form of collective violence involving multiple people, while Gertrude remained the adult at the center of the household. As the weeks passed, Sylvia's physical condition deteriorated severely. She was beaten repeatedly, deprived of adequate food and water, humiliated, injured in different ways, and kept away from the outside world. Her severe malnutrition would later become an important part of the medical explanation for her death. The injuries found on her body were at different stages, demonstrating that the violence had not been confined to one day or one attack. It had developed over an extended period. Yet the house was not completely hidden from the outside world. Other children were around the residence, and some neighbors knew that Sylvia was being treated badly. There were screams. Still, no intervention came soon enough to save her. The question of why those around the house did not intervene would remain one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. It is a question that can be asked without inventing motives or assigning thoughts to people for which the available facts provide no evidence. What can be established is that Sylvia remained in the house while her condition became increasingly serious. By October 26, 1965, she was in critical condition. She died that day inside the Banaszewski residence. When police arrived, they found her body upstairs. The medical findings provided the first clear indication of the scale of what had occurred. Sylvia had suffered a subdural hematoma caused by a blow to the head, as well as shock and severe malnutrition. The injuries present on her body came from different stages of the abuse, making it clear that investigators were not dealing with one isolated act of violence. They were confronting the result of a prolonged period in which Sylvia had been repeatedly harmed and left in a severely deteriorated condition. But the discovery of her body was only the beginning of the investigation. Gertrude Banaszewski had an explanation for what had happened, and it pointed away from the house. She told police that Sylvia had been attacked by a group of young men. She also produced a note purportedly written by Sylvia, intended to support the claim that Sylvia had encountered danger outside the home. But the physical evidence began to undermine that account. Sylvia's injuries did not fit the explanation of a single outside attack. There were signs of older and newer injuries, and her severe malnutrition could not be explained by the story Gertrude was presenting. Investigators, therefore, began looking more closely at the people inside the house. Among them was Jenny Likens. Jenny had been living in the same environment and knew what had happened to her sister. After police arrived, Jenny approached them with a condition. She wanted to be taken out of the house immediately. Her information became a crucial turning point in the investigation. It helped undermine Gertrude's initial account and helped investigators identify the people who had been involved in the abuse. The investigation began to move inward, away from the alleged strangers Gertrude had described and toward the household where Sylvia had spent her final months. Members of the Banaszewski household and several juveniles connected to the abuse were arrested. Some children were treated as witnesses and later released to testify. Gertrude's younger children were placed with adoptive families or care institutions. By the end of December 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury had indicted Gertrude Banaszewski and other participants on charges including first-degree murder. The house on East New York Street had become the center of a murder investigation, and the question was no longer simply how Sylvia Likens had died. Investigators now had to establish who had participated in the events that led to her death, what responsibility each person carried, and how a 16-year-old girl could have remained inside that home for so long while her condition deteriorated. The answers would soon move from the police investigation into an Indiana courtroom, where Gertrude Banaszewski and the other defendants would face the consequences of what had happened to Sylvia. The investigation into Sylvia Likens' death had begun with a body, a house, and a story that did not withstand the evidence. But behind the police reports and the emerging accusations was a second story, one that could not be understood simply through the circumstances of October 26, 1965. To understand the case, investigators and eventually the court had to look backward, toward the weeks in which Sylvia had gradually been separated from the ordinary life she had known before entering the Banaszewski home. She had arrived in Indianapolis with her 15-year-old sister, Jenny, under circumstances that were not unusual for their family. Their parents, Lester and Betty Likens, worked in connection with traveling fairs and frequently had to move from place to place. Because their work required periods of travel, Sylvia and Jenny needed somewhere to stay while their parents were away. That was how the two sisters came to live with Gertrude Banaszewski and her children on East New York Street. Gertrude was a divorced mother raising several children. The arrangement was based on a simple exchange of responsibility and payment. Sylvia and Jenny would remain in the Banaszewski household, and their parents would provide weekly money for their care. The girls were not entering the house as strangers seeking shelter from danger. They were being placed there because an adult was expected to supervise them while their parents were away. At the beginning, the arrangement appeared to function normally. Sylvia and Jenny lived with the Banaszewski family without any indication that the situation would become fatal. There was no obvious sign that the 16-year-old girl would soon be isolated from the world outside the house, or that the home in which she had been placed would become the place where she would die. The first major source of tension described in the case involved money. The payments from the Likens family began arriving irregularly. For Gertrude, who was already living under difficult circumstances and responsible for several children, the financial arrangement became a growing source of frustration. As that tension increased, her anger began to focus on Sylvia and Jenny. The initial response was punishment, but the distinction between punishment and abuse soon disappeared. Sylvia became the particular target of increasingly severe treatment. The reasons given for punishing her could be minor, but the consequences became increasingly serious. The facts of the case do not provide a single credible explanation for why Sylvia, specifically, became the focus of such extreme abuse. Instead, they show a gradual escalation. Gertrude and children around her began circulating accusations about Sylvia. Some of those accusations concerned sexual and moral behavior. According to the information available in this case, there was no credible foundation for those allegations. Yet they became part of the justification for treating Sylvia as someone who deserved punishment. Once that idea had taken hold inside the household, Sylvia's position changed. She was no longer simply one of two girls staying temporarily with another family. She was increasingly isolated and controlled. She was beaten for reasons that could be extremely minor. Her freedom was reduced. Eventually, she was no longer permitted to attend school. Her connection to the world outside the Banaszewski home became weaker, while the authority of the people inside the house over her became stronger. Eventually, she was confined in the basement area. The physical location mattered because it reflected the larger change taking place in Sylvia's life. She was being removed from the ordinary routines of a 16-year-old girl and placed in an environment where those responsible for her welfare had increasing control over every part of her existence. The abuse did not remain limited to Gertrude. Several of her children and other juveniles from the neighborhood became involved. Paula Banaszewski, Gertrude's daughter, was among those later prosecuted. So were John Banaszewski Jr., Gertrude's son, and two 15-year-old neighborhood boys, Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard. Another Banaszewski child, Stephanie, was also arrested, but she later cooperated with prosecutors and became a witness. Their involvement created one of the most disturbing elements of the case. The violence against Sylvia had become collective. Multiple young people participated in what was happening inside the household, while the adult who was supposed to provide care remained at the center of the environment. The facts do not require an invented explanation for every individual decision made by every participant. What they demonstrate is that Sylvia was no longer facing a single person. She was facing a household in which several people had become involved in her mistreatment. As the weeks continued, the consequences became increasingly severe. Sylvia was beaten repeatedly. She was deprived of adequate food and water. She was humiliated and subjected to different forms of injury. She was prevented from returning to normal life outside the home. The effects accumulated. Her body became severely malnourished, and the injuries found later by investigators existed at different stages. That distinction was important. The condition of Sylvia's body was evidence that what had happened was not one sudden act. The injuries represented a prolonged period of abuse. Her physical deterioration was taking place over time inside a house where she had been placed for protection, and the abuse was not entirely unknown beyond the walls of that residence. Other children were present around the house. Some neighbors knew Sylvia was being treated badly. There were screams, yet no intervention came soon enough to prevent her death. This part of the case raises one of its most difficult questions, but it is important to separate the question from speculation. The available information establishes that some people outside the household were aware that something was wrong. It does not provide a complete explanation for what each person knew, what each person believed, or why each person failed to intervene. What can be said with certainty is that Sylvia remained in the Banaszewski home while her condition continued to worsen. By the final weeks, she was severely weakened. The combination of repeated violence, deprivation, isolation, and malnutrition had left her in critical condition. Then came October 26, 1965. Sylvia Likens died inside the Banaszewski residence. She was 16 years old. Her death transformed the situation from an ongoing pattern of abuse into a homicide investigation. When police arrived, they found her body upstairs. The condition of the body immediately raised questions about the explanation Gertrude Banaszewski would provide. The medical findings would become central to answering those questions. The official cause of death was a subdural hematoma resulting from a blow to the head, combined with shock and severe malnutrition. The evidence of injuries at different stages showed that the violence had been prolonged. Sylvia had not simply suffered one fatal blow in an isolated confrontation. Her death was the culmination of a period during which she had been repeatedly injured and deprived of basic necessities. Gertrude nevertheless attempted to direct the investigation elsewhere. She told police that Sylvia had been attacked by a group of young men. She also produced a note purportedly written by Sylvia, which was presented as support for the idea that the girl had encountered danger outside the home. But the physical evidence made that account increasingly difficult to accept. The injuries did not fit a single outside attack. The signs of older and newer injuries pointed towards something that had been happening over time. Her severe malnutrition raised another problem for the explanation. It could not be accounted for simply by an isolated assault. Investigators, therefore, began turning their attention back toward the household itself. The people living in the house were no longer merely witnesses to a tragedy. They were becoming central subjects of the investigation. And among them was Sylvia's own sister, Jenny. Jenny had remained inside the same environment and had witnessed enough to understand that her sister's death could not be explained by the story Gertrude had initially presented. After police arrived, Jenny approached them. She gave information with a condition. She wanted to be taken out of the house immediately. That moment became an important turning point. Jenny's account helped investigators break through the initial explanation and begin identifying the people who had participated in Sylvia's abuse. The investigation expanded. Members of the Banaszewski household were arrested, along with juveniles connected to the abuse. Some children were considered witnesses and later released to testify. Gertrude's younger children were placed with adoptive families or care institutions. By the end of December 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury had indicted Gertrude Banaszewski and other participants, including charges of first-degree murder. The house on East New York Street had now become the center of a major criminal case. But the investigation had established only the beginning of responsibility. The next question would be how that responsibility should be divided among an adult caretaker, her children, and the neighborhood teenagers who had become involved. The answer would have to come through testimony, evidence, and the courtroom. In 1966, the story of Sylvia Likens would move from the house where she had died to an Indiana courtroom, where the people accused of participating in her abuse would finally face judgment. By the time the investigation moved toward the courtroom, the central question was no longer whether Sylvia Likens had suffered a violent death. The physical evidence had already established that. The question was how the events inside the Banaszewski home had unfolded, who had taken part, and how responsibility should be assigned among the people connected to the house. The investigation had begun with Gertrude Banaszewski's account of an outside attack. But that explanation had steadily weakened as investigators examined Sylvia's condition and listened to the people who had been inside the household. What appeared at first to be a possible attack by strangers was becoming a case centered on people Sylvia had known and depended upon. The first major problem with Gertrude's story was the condition of Sylvia's body. The medical findings did not describe the aftermath of one isolated assault. Sylvia had a subdural hematoma caused by a blow to the head, but that was only part of the picture. She was also suffering from shock and severe malnutrition, and her body showed numerous injuries at different stages. Those findings indicated a prolonged period of abuse. The distinction was crucial to the investigation. If Sylvia had been attacked once by people outside the house, investigators would have expected the evidence to tell a different story. Instead, the injuries suggested repeated violence over time, combined with deprivation that had left the 16-year-old severely weakened. Her condition, therefore, forced investigators to look beyond the explanation initially offered by Gertrude. The alleged group of young men was no longer the only possible focus. The people who had been living around Sylvia during the months before her death became increasingly important. The Banaszewski household itself had to be examined as the setting in which the abuse had taken place. That meant looking at Gertrude, her children, and the juveniles from the neighborhood who had become involved. It also meant understanding the difference between what investigators could establish and what they could only suspect. The facts available in the case show a clear progression of abuse, but they do not provide a complete transcript of every event that occurred inside the house. What investigators could establish was that Sylvia had been isolated, beaten, deprived of food and water, humiliated, injured, and prevented from continuing her ordinary life. She had eventually been confined in the basement area. The violence had involved more than one person, and by the time she died, the consequences were visible in her physical condition. One of the most important developments came from inside the family itself. Jenny Likens, Sylvia's 15-year-old sister, had also been living in the Banaszewski home. Jenny knew what had happened to Sylvia. When police arrived after Sylvia's death, Jenny approached them and provided information. But she did so with a condition that revealed the urgency of her own situation. She wanted to be removed from the house immediately. Jenny's account became a turning point because it helped investigators move beyond Gertrude's initial explanation. Her information contributed to identifying the people who had been involved in the abuse and helped expose the fact that Sylvia's death was connected to events inside the residence rather than an unexplained attack by outsiders. For investigators, Jenny represented something the initial story could not account for: a person who had lived inside the household and could provide information about what had happened there. Her position was especially important because she was not a distant observer. She was Sylvia's sister, and she had been present in the same environment. At the same time, the investigation revealed that the abuse had not been confined to the relationship between Gertrude and Sylvia. Several other young people became part of the case. Paula Banaszewski, Gertrude's daughter, was later prosecuted. So was John Banaszewski Jr., Gertrude's son. Two 15-year-old neighborhood boys, Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard, were also prosecuted. Another of Gertrude's children, Stephanie Banaszewski, was arrested but later cooperated with prosecutors and became a witness. The involvement of these young people created a complicated question for investigators and prosecutors. The people connected to Sylvia's death were not all adults, and they did not all occupy the same position within the household. Gertrude was the adult caretaker. Paula and John were her children. Hobbs and Hubbard were neighborhood teenagers. Their ages and relationships to Sylvia differed, as did their eventual charges and sentences. The investigation, therefore, had to move beyond the simple question of who had been present. It had to establish individual responsibility. The arrests began to reflect that broader investigation. Members of the Banaszewski household were taken into custody, along with juveniles connected to Sylvia's abuse. Some children were treated as witnesses and later released to testify. Gertrude's younger children were removed from the environment and placed with adoptive families or care institutions. The household that had once been the place where Sylvia was supposed to stay while her parents traveled had now been broken apart by a homicide investigation. By the end of December 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury had indicted Gertrude Banaszewski and other participants on charges including first-degree murder. The indictment marked a major transition. The investigation had moved from the question of what happened to Sylvia toward the legal question of who could be held responsible for it. But the prosecution still faced the challenge of presenting the story clearly enough for a jury to understand how months of abuse had culminated in death. The evidence had to connect the physical condition of Sylvia's body with the events that had taken place inside the home. The accounts of people who had been there had to be considered alongside the medical findings. And the prosecution had to address the different roles of the defendants rather than treating them as though they had all occupied the same position. At the center of that case stood Gertrude Banaszewski. She had been the adult entrusted with Sylvia's care. The original arrangement had been based on the expectation that Sylvia and Jenny would be safe while their parents were away. Instead, Sylvia had become the principal target of escalating abuse inside the home. That fact would become central to the prosecution's portrayal of Gertrude's responsibility. The medical evidence provided another foundation. Sylvia's death was attributed to a subdural hematoma caused by a blow to the head. Combined with shock and severe malnutrition, the injuries at different stages demonstrated the prolonged nature of the abuse. This meant that the prosecution did not have to rely solely on one moment or one injury. The overall condition of Sylvia provided evidence of what had happened over a period of time. The investigation also confronted the disturbing reality that some people outside the immediate household knew Sylvia was being treated badly. The Banaszewski residence was not isolated. Other children were around the home, and some neighbors were aware that Sylvia was being mistreated. There were screams, yet no intervention came soon enough. For the investigators, however, the most immediate task was not to answer every broader question about the neighborhood. It was to determine who had participated in the abuse and establish the facts necessary for prosecution. By the time the grand jury acted, the investigation had therefore assembled several interconnected elements. Sylvia's severely injured and malnourished body, evidence indicating prolonged abuse. Gertrude's initial account of an outside attack. The weakness of that explanation in light of the medical evidence, Jenny's information, and the identification of several people who had participated in the abuse. Together, these elements transformed the case. What had first been presented as an unexplained death caused by outsiders was now understood as the culmination of a prolonged pattern of violence within the household. The next stage would be the courtroom. In 1966, Gertrude Banaszewski and the other defendants would face trial. Their ages, relationships to Sylvia, and individual roles would become critical as the court attempted to determine responsibility for the death of a 16-year-old girl who had entered the house expecting care and never left it alive. By the time the case reached the courtroom in 1966, the facts surrounding Sylvia Likens' death had become increasingly difficult to separate from the environment in which she had spent her final months. The prosecution was not dealing with a single moment that could be examined in isolation. It was dealing with a 16-year-old girl whose condition had deteriorated over time, a household in which several people had become involved in her mistreatment, and an adult caretaker who had been responsible for her welfare. The trial would therefore have to establish not only what happened to Sylvia, but how the responsibility of each defendant should be understood under the law. There were 5 principal defendants brought to trial: Gertrude Banaszewski, Paula Banaszewski, John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard. Their relationships to Sylvia and to one another were different. Gertrude was the adult who had agreed to care for Sylvia and Jenny while their parents were away. Paula and John were her children. Hobbs and Hubbard were 15-year-old neighborhood boys. Another Banaszewski child, Stephanie, had been arrested but later cooperated with prosecutors and became a witness. The prosecution, therefore, had to present a case involving several people whose roles were not identical, while demonstrating how their actions related to Sylvia's prolonged abuse and eventual death. At the center of the trial was Gertrude Banaszewski. She had been the adult responsible for the household, and Sylvia had originally been placed there because her parents believed she would be cared for while they traveled for work. Instead, the evidence described a progression in which Sylvia was increasingly punished, isolated, deprived, and physically harmed. The financial tension surrounding the irregular payments from Sylvia's family had been an early source of conflict. But the violence eventually went far beyond any dispute over money. Accusations about Sylvia's supposed sexual and moral behavior became part of the environment in which she was treated as though she deserved punishment. According to the supplied information, those accusations had no credible foundation, yet they contributed to the way Sylvia was increasingly targeted. She was eventually prevented from attending school and confined in the house, later in the basement area. By the time of her death, her condition showed the cumulative consequences of what had happened. The medical evidence was central to the case. Sylvia had suffered a subdural hematoma caused by a blow to the head. She was also in shock and severely malnourished. Her body carried injuries from different stages, demonstrating that the violence had not occurred only once. This evidence gave the prosecution a way to establish the prolonged nature of the abuse. The case was not simply about the final injury that caused Sylvia's death. It was about the condition in which she had been left after weeks of mistreatment. Another important element was the failure of Gertrude's initial explanation. After Sylvia's death, Gertrude told police that Sylvia had been attacked by a group of young men. She also produced a note purportedly written by Sylvia to support the claim that the girl had encountered danger outside the home. But the physical evidence did not fit that explanation. The injuries appeared at different stages, and the severe malnutrition could not reasonably be accounted for by a single outside attack. Investigators therefore focused on the people who had been inside the house and on the accounts provided by those who knew what had occurred there. Jenny Likens became particularly important. She had been living in the same home and had witnessed what happened to her sister. When police arrived, Jenny approached them and gave information with one immediate condition. She wanted to be taken out of the house. Her account helped investigators move beyond Gertrude's original story and identify people who had been involved in Sylvia's abuse. Jenny's position was especially significant because she had experienced the environment personally. She was not reporting something she had heard from a distant source. She and Sylvia had entered the Banaszewski household together, and Jenny remained there until the police intervention following Sylvia's death. Her information helped reveal the connection between Sylvia's condition and the people living around her. The prosecution also had to address the involvement of the other defendants. Paula Banaszewski was charged with second-degree murder. John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard were charged in connection with Sylvia's death and ultimately convicted of manslaughter. Their eventual sentences differed from Gertrude's, reflecting the different legal judgments made about their responsibility. The presence of juvenile defendants made the case particularly complicated. Hobbs and Hubbard were only 15. John Banaszewski Jr. was Gertrude's son. The courtroom therefore had to distinguish between the adult caretaker and the younger participants, rather than treating everyone involved as though they had held the same authority or responsibility. Gertrude's defense included a claim that she suffered from mental illness. She denied the charges and relied on that defense during the trial. The jury, however, did not accept it. The prosecution's case, supported by the evidence surrounding Sylvia's condition and the accounts of people connected to the household, resulted in a conviction. On May 19, 1966, Gertrude Banaszewski was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Paula Banaszewski was convicted of second-degree murder and also received a life sentence. John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard were convicted of manslaughter. Their sentences ranged from 2 to 21 years. The verdicts represented the first major legal conclusion in the case. Gertrude, who had been responsible for Sylvia's care, was held guilty of first-degree murder. Paula was held responsible for second-degree murder. The three younger defendants received manslaughter convictions, but the case did not end with those verdicts. Gertrude Banaszewski appealed her conviction, and the legal process would eventually reopen the case. Before that happened, however, the first trial established the essential narrative that would remain at the center of the case. Sylvia Likens had died after a prolonged period of abuse inside the home where she had been placed for care. The courtroom had rejected the idea that her death could be explained simply as the result of an attack by strangers. The evidence and testimony had instead directed responsibility toward the household itself. The significance of the verdict extended beyond the legal classifications attached to each defendant. It also demonstrated how the investigation had transformed the understanding of Sylvia's death. What began with Gertrude's claim of an outside assault became a case involving an adult caretaker, her children, and neighborhood juveniles. The medical evidence showed that Sylvia's suffering had accumulated over time. Jenny's information helped investigators identify those involved. The arrests and indictments followed, and the trial ultimately assigned different levels of criminal responsibility. Yet the first conviction was not the final legal word on Gertrude Banaszewski. In 1970, the Indiana Supreme Court reversed the original conviction and ordered a new trial. The decision was based on issues involving the trial process and jury selection, rather than a finding that Gertrude was innocent. That distinction is essential. The reversal did not erase the evidence concerning Sylvia's death, nor did it establish that Gertrude had been wrongly accused. It meant that the legal process had to begin again with a new trial. For a case that had already shocked Indiana, the prospect of another trial meant that Sylvia's story would once again return to the courtroom. The prosecution would have to present the case again, and Gertrude would once again face the charge of first-degree murder. The second trial would become another chapter in a case that had already revealed a prolonged pattern of abuse, a failed attempt to blame outsiders, and the participation of multiple people. In 1971, Gertrude was tried again and once more convicted of first-degree murder. The second conviction restored the legal judgment against her. The case had survived the reversal, and the finding of guilt remained. But even after the retrial, the story of Gertrude Banaszewski and Sylvia Likens would continue to raise questions that extended beyond the courtroom. The most immediate was how Gertrude, after being convicted of first-degree murder, would eventually leave prison. Another was how the people around the Banaszewski home had been able to know that Sylvia was being mistreated without an intervention coming soon enough. And perhaps the most enduring question concerned the responsibility of adults and communities when a child is placed in danger. Sylvia had entered the house because her parents needed someone to care for her while they were away. She left it only after her death. The trial had established criminal responsibility, but it could not undo what had happened to her. The next chapter of the case would therefore move beyond the verdict itself. Through Gertrude's years in prison, her eventual parole, the public reaction to her release, and the broader consequences that Sylvia's death would have for the way Indiana confronted child abuse. The conviction of Gertrude Banaszewski in 1966 appeared, for a time, to bring the courtroom chapter of Sylvia Likens' case to an end. Gertrude had been found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Paula Banaszewski had been convicted of second-degree murder and also sentenced to life. John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard had been convicted of manslaughter, receiving sentences ranging from 2 to 21 years. The verdicts had established different levels of legal responsibility among the defendants, but they did not erase the circumstances that had brought the case to court. Sylvia was still dead, and the evidence had established that her death followed a prolonged period of abuse inside the home where she had been placed for care. Yet Gertrude Banaszewski did not accept the original judgment as the final word. She appealed her conviction, beginning another stage in a case that had already drawn intense attention. In 1970, the Indiana Supreme Court reversed Gertrude's original conviction and ordered a new trial. The decision was important, but it is equally important to understand what it did not mean. The reversal was not a declaration that Gertrude was innocent. It did not establish that Sylvia had not been abused, nor did it erase the evidence that had led to Gertrude's conviction. Instead, the decision concerned issues involving the trial process and the selection of the jury. Because of those legal problems, the original conviction could not simply remain in place. A new trial was required. For Sylvia's story, this meant that the events surrounding her death would have to be brought before a courtroom once again. The reversal created a difficult distinction between legal procedure and the underlying facts of the case. A conviction can be overturned because a trial was conducted improperly, even when the underlying allegations remain extraordinarily serious. That distinction mattered in Gertrude's case. The new trial was not an opportunity to declare the past irrelevant. It was a requirement that the legal process be carried out again. In 1971, Gertrude Banaszewski was tried for a second time. Once again, the charge was first-degree murder. Once again, the case centered on the death of Sylvia Likens and the circumstances inside the Banaszewski home. And once again, Gertrude was found guilty. The second conviction meant that the reversal of 1970 had not resulted in her exoneration. The legal judgment against her was restored through the retrial. The conviction remained one of the defining outcomes of the case, and Gertrude returned to prison to serve her sentence. By then, years had passed since Sylvia's death. Sylvia had died in October 1965, only 16 years old. The first trial had taken place in 1966. The appeal had reached the Indiana Supreme Court by 1970. The retrial followed in 1971. The legal process had stretched across several years, but the central facts remained unchanged. Sylvia had been placed in Gertrude's care while her parents were away. She had been subjected to escalating abuse, and she had died after suffering severe injuries, shock, and malnutrition. Gertrude's imprisonment lasted for nearly 2 decades. During those years, the public memory of Sylvia's case did not disappear. The circumstances surrounding the crime had made it one of the most disturbing murder cases in Indiana, and the eventual possibility of Gertrude's release would bring the case back into public attention. In 1985, after nearly 2 decades in prison, Gertrude Banaszewski was granted parole. The decision produced a strong public reaction. More than 40,000 signatures were collected on a petition opposing her release. The scale of the petition demonstrated that the case had not simply become an old criminal matter. For many people, the idea of Gertrude leaving prison remained deeply troubling because of the nature of Sylvia's death and the responsibility Gertrude had held as the adult caretaker. The issue was not only that Gertrude had been convicted of murder. It was that the victim had been a 16-year-old girl who had entered the household under an arrangement intended to keep her safe. The fact that Gertrude was eventually released, therefore, became one of the most controversial later developments in the case. After her parole, Gertrude left Indiana and moved to Iowa, where she lived under another name. The move placed distance between her and the location where Sylvia had died, but it did not remove the historical significance of the case. Gertrude's life after prison was far removed from the life Sylvia never had the opportunity to live. Sylvia had been 16 when she died. She would never grow older, leave school, build a career, establish a family, or experience the ordinary changes that would have followed adolescence. Gertrude, by contrast, lived for years after her release. On June 16, 1990, she died in Iowa at the age of 60 from lung cancer. With her death, the principal defendant in one of Indiana's most notorious child murder cases was gone. But the questions surrounding Sylvia's death remained. One of the most difficult concerned the people beyond Gertrude and the other defendants. The Banaszewski home was not isolated from the neighborhood. Other children were present around the residence. Some neighbors knew that Sylvia was being treated badly. There were screams, yet intervention did not come soon enough. The case, therefore, became more than a question of individual criminal responsibility. It also became a question about what happens when warning signs are visible but action does not follow. The supplied information does not provide a complete explanation of what each neighbor knew or why each person failed to intervene. So those gaps cannot responsibly be filled with speculation. But the broader fact remains. People outside the immediate household were aware that Sylvia was experiencing mistreatment, and she still died inside the home. That reality became part of the case's lasting impact. Sylvia's death also contributed to a broader discussion about society's responsibility toward children experiencing abuse. According to the information provided, the case was later connected to changes in Indiana's approach to child abuse reporting. A 2024 account citing Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center described the case as contributing to the development of requirements for people who know about child abuse to report it. The significance of such requirements is straightforward. A child who is being harmed may not have the ability, freedom, or opportunity to remove themselves from the situation. When the adults responsible for that child fail to protect them, the responsibility may extend outward to others who become aware of what is happening. Sylvia's case demonstrated the devastating consequences of waiting too long. The house on East New York Street had contained the immediate events of the crime, but the questions raised by those events extended far beyond its walls. Who should have recognized the danger? When does concern become a responsibility to act? And what happens when a child is isolated from the institutions and routines that might otherwise provide protection? These questions became inseparable from Sylvia's legacy. The legal system had answered one set of questions through the convictions of Gertrude and the other. Defendants. It had established that criminal responsibility existed and had assigned different levels of punishment. But a courtroom could not reverse the months of suffering or return Sylvia to her family. It could not restore the life that had been taken from a 16-year-old girl. The later parole of Gertrude added another layer to the case, because it demonstrated that even a life sentence does not necessarily mean imprisonment until death. Public opposition to the parole showed that many people continued to view Sylvia's death as a crime that demanded a permanent moral reckoning, regardless of the legal mechanisms governing release. Gertrude's eventual death in 1990 closed her personal story, but it did not close Sylvia's. Sylvia remained the victim whose name defined the case. Her story began with an ordinary family decision. Parents who traveled for work arranged for their two daughters to stay with another family. That decision placed Sylvia in a home where she was supposed to receive care. Instead, the situation deteriorated from financial tension to physical punishment, from punishment to isolation, and from isolation to prolonged abuse involving multiple people. By the time investigators arrived on October 26, 1965, the 16-year-old girl was dead. The investigation, trials, appeal, retrial, imprisonment, and parole that followed all grew from that single tragedy. But the most important fact remains the simplest one. Sylvia Likens was 16 years old when her life ended. She was not responsible for the circumstances that placed her in the Banaszewski home. She did not deserve the treatment she received there. And whatever legal questions followed after her death, none of them changed the fundamental reality that a child who had been entrusted to adult care was failed by the people who should have protected her. The story of Sylvia Likens does not end with the conviction of Gertrude Banaszewski, nor with the second conviction that followed the appeal. A criminal case can establish responsibility, impose punishment, and create an official record of what happened. But the death of a 16-year-old girl leaves questions that are larger than any verdict. In Sylvia's case, those questions concern not only the people who directly participated in her abuse, but also the circumstances that allowed the abuse to continue for months. They concern the responsibilities of adults, the vulnerability of children, and the consequences of silence when signs of danger are visible. Sylvia had entered the Banaszewski household for a simple reason. Her parents, Lester and Betty Likens, worked in connection with traveling fairs and frequently had to move from place to place. While they were away, Sylvia and her 15-year-old sister, Jenny, needed somewhere to stay. Gertrude Banaszewski agreed to care for them in exchange for weekly payment. There was nothing inherently unusual about the arrangement. It depended on a basic expectation that an adult entrusted with two children would provide them with safety and supervision. Instead, Sylvia became increasingly isolated inside the home. The first tension described in the case involved money. Payments from the Likens family became irregular, creating conflict in a household where Gertrude was already responsible for several children. That tension was followed by physical punishment, and the punishment escalated. Sylvia became the principal target. Accusations about her sexual and moral behavior circulated within the household, despite the lack of credible foundation described in the case. Those accusations helped create an environment in which Sylvia was treated as though she deserved what was being done to her. Eventually, her life outside the house was taken away. She was no longer permitted to attend school. She was kept inside the home and later confined in the basement area. Her isolation was not simply physical. It separated her from the ordinary routines and relationships that might have provided opportunities for someone outside the household to recognize the full extent of what was happening. The abuse then became collective. Gertrude was not the only person involved. Paula Banaszewski and John Banaszewski Jr., Gertrude's children, became defendants in the case. Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard, both 15-year-old neighborhood boys, were also prosecuted. Stephanie Banaszewski was arrested as well, but later cooperated with prosecutors and became a witness. The involvement of several young people made the case especially disturbing because it demonstrated how abuse within a household could expand beyond one person. Sylvia's suffering became known to others, and some of those others participated rather than stopping it. The available information does not allow every individual's motives to be reconstructed, and it would be irresponsible to invent thoughts or conversations that are not documented. What can be established is the pattern itself. Sylvia was beaten repeatedly, deprived of adequate food and water, humiliated, injured, and kept away from ordinary life. Her physical condition deteriorated severely. When medical examination was conducted after her death, investigators found injuries at different stages, demonstrating that the violence had occurred over a period of time. Her severe malnutrition was another indication of prolonged deprivation. Her official cause of death was a subdural hematoma resulting from a blow to the head, combined with shock and severe malnutrition. Those findings became an essential part of understanding the case because they demonstrated that Sylvia's death was not the result of a single unexplained incident. It was the culmination of sustained mistreatment. That distinction also exposed the weakness in Gertrude's initial explanation. After Sylvia died, Gertrude told police that a group of young men had attacked her. She produced a note purportedly written by Sylvia to support the account. But the physical evidence did not fit the explanation. The injuries existed at different stages, and Sylvia's severe malnutrition could not be explained by a single outside assault. Investigators, therefore, turned their attention toward the household. Jenny Likens became an important witness. She approached police after Sylvia's death and provided information with one immediate condition. She wanted to be removed from the house. Her account helped investigators move away from Gertrude's original explanation and identify people who had participated in the abuse. The arrest that followed revealed the full scope of the legal case. Gertrude was charged with first-degree murder. Paula was charged with second-degree murder. John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard faced manslaughter charges. The different charges reflected the different legal positions of the defendants. Gertrude was the adult caretaker. The others were younger participants. Hobbs and Hubbard were only 15. The trial in 1966 resulted in convictions for all 5 principal defendants. On May 19th, Gertrude was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Paula was convicted of second-degree murder and also received a life sentence. John, Richard, and Coy were convicted of manslaughter and received sentences ranging from 2 to 21 years. Gertrude appealed, and in 1970 the Indiana Supreme Court reversed her original conviction and ordered a new trial because of issues involving the trial process and jury selection. The reversal did not establish innocence. In 1971, Gertrude was tried again and once again convicted of first-degree murder. Her legal responsibility was therefore reaffirmed after the retrial. Yet the later history of the case would demonstrate another distinction. A life sentence did not necessarily mean that Gertrude would remain imprisoned until death. In 1985, after nearly 2 decades in prison, she was granted parole. The decision provoked intense public opposition. More than 40,000 signatures were collected on a petition opposing her release. That reaction reflected the continuing public memory of Sylvia's death. Nearly 20 years had passed, but the central fact remained unchanged. Sylvia had been 16 when she died, and Gertrude had been the adult entrusted with her care. After her release, Gertrude left Indiana and lived in Iowa under another name. She died there on June 16, 1990, at the age of 60, from lung cancer. Her death ended the life of the principal defendant. But it did not end the significance of Sylvia's story. The case continued to raise questions about the responsibilities of people who witness abuse. The Banaszewski home was not isolated. Other children were around the house, and some neighbors knew that Sylvia was being treated badly. There were screams, yet no intervention came soon enough to save her. The available information does not establish exactly what every neighbor knew or why each individual failed to intervene. Those details should not be filled with speculation. But the broader fact is unavoidable. Sylvia's suffering was not entirely invisible. People outside the immediate household had indications that something was wrong, and still the abuse continued until her death. That reality became part of the case's lasting significance. The question is not simply whether someone should have known. It is what responsibility exists when someone does know or believes that a child is being harmed. A child may not be able to leave an abusive environment independently. A child may be isolated from school, friends, relatives, or other adults who could provide assistance. In Sylvia's case, those protective connections were progressively weakened. She was no longer attending school. She was being kept inside the house. She was increasingly dependent on the same environment in which she was being harmed. The case, therefore, became connected to a broader discussion about child protection and the duty to report abuse. The information provided notes that the case contributed to later changes in Indiana's approach to reporting child abuse. A 2024 account citing Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center described the case as contributing to Indiana's development of requirements that people who know about child abuse reported. The importance of such requirements lies in a simple principle. Responsibility for protecting children cannot rest solely with the person who happens to have custody of them. When a child is being harmed, the possibility of intervention may depend on someone outside the immediate household recognizing the danger and taking action. Sylvia's case became an enduring example of what can happen when that protection fails. But her legacy should not be reduced to the violence inflicted upon her. It is easy for a case this disturbing to become defined by the details of what happened to the victim. Yet Sylvia was more than the injuries documented after her death. She was a 16-year-old girl who had a 15-year-old sister, parents who worked traveling fairs, and a life that should have continued beyond 1965. She entered the Banaszewski home because an adult had agreed to care for her. She should have returned to her family when her parents came back. Instead, she died there. Remembering that distinction is important. Sylvia's identity should not disappear beneath the crimes committed against her. The case remains horrifying because of the abuse, but its human meaning lies in the life that was lost. The legal proceedings could assign responsibility after her death, but they could not restore what had been taken. The convictions could establish guilt, but they could not return Sylvia to Jenny or to her parents. The parole decision could release Gertrude, but it could not change the outcome for Sylvia. And Gertrude's death in 1990 could not close the questions that remained about the people who knew, the people who participated, and the systems that failed to protect a vulnerable child. More than anything, Sylvia's story leaves a question that is both simple and difficult. When a child is being harmed and the people around that child become aware of it, what responsibility do they have to intervene? The history of Sylvia Likens demonstrates why that question matters. Her death was the final result of a process that developed gradually: financial tension, escalating punishment, isolation, deprivation, collective abuse, severe physical deterioration, and finally death. The process did not begin with a single fatal moment. It developed over time, giving opportunities for intervention that never came soon enough. That is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the case. The tragedy was not only that Sylvia died. It was that she suffered for so long before she did, inside a place where she was supposed to be safe. The final chapter of Sylvia Likens' story is not found in another courtroom, another arrest, or another sentence. It is found in the questions that remained after all of those things had happened. Gertrude Banaszewski had been convicted twice. The other defendants had received their own convictions and sentences. Gertrude had spent nearly 2 decades in prison before being granted parole in 1985, and she later died in Iowa in 1990. Legally, the case had reached its conclusion. But the history of Sylvia Likens continued to matter because the circumstances of her death exposed something more difficult to measure than criminal responsibility: the failure to protect a child who had been placed in the care of an adult. Sylvia was 16 years old when she died. That fact is easy to repeat, but it becomes more meaningful when placed against the circumstances of her final months. She had entered the Banaszewski household with her 15-year-old sister, Jenny, because their parents, Lester and Betty Likens, worked in connection with traveling fairs and needed someone to care for their daughters while they were away. Gertrude Banaszewski agreed to take the girls into her home in exchange for weekly payment. The arrangement was built around trust. It assumed that an adult would provide food, supervision, and safety. Instead, the relationship deteriorated into prolonged abuse. The transformation was gradual. The payments from Sylvia's family became irregular, and this created tension in the Banaszewski household. Gertrude's financial difficulties and responsibility for several children formed part of the background. But the violence that followed went far beyond any disagreement over money. Sylvia became a particular target. Accusations concerning her behavior circulated within the household, including accusations involving her sexuality and morality that, according to the information available in the case, had no credible foundation. Yet those accusations became part of the justification for treating her as though she deserved punishment. That change was fundamental. Once Sylvia had been labeled as someone who supposedly deserved punishment, each subsequent act of abuse could be presented within the household as another form of discipline. But what happened was no longer discipline. Sylvia was beaten. She was deprived of adequate food and water. She was humiliated and injured. She was eventually prevented from attending school and kept inside the house. Later, she was confined in the basement area. Her access to the ordinary world became increasingly restricted, while her dependence on the people inside the Banaszewski home became increasingly complete. The abuse also expanded beyond Gertrude. Paula Banaszewski, John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard were among those eventually prosecuted. Hobbs and Hubbard were 15-year-old neighborhood boys. Stephanie Banaszewski was also arrested but later cooperated with prosecutors and became a witness. Their involvement made the case more than an individual crime committed by one adult. It became a case involving a group of people, including several juveniles, who became involved in the mistreatment of a vulnerable girl. The precise motives of each participant cannot be reconstructed beyond the information provided, and there is no reason to invent explanations that the evidence does not establish. What can be established is that Sylvia's isolation did not protect her from further harm. Instead, it allowed the abuse to continue. The condition of Sylvia's body after her death provided the clearest evidence of how prolonged the suffering had been. Her injuries existed at different stages. She was severely malnourished. Her official cause of death was a subdural hematoma caused by a blow to the head. Combined with shock and severe malnutrition, the medical findings demonstrated that the fatal event could not be understood separately from the weeks of abuse that preceded it. This was not simply the story of a sudden attack. It was the story of accumulated harm. That distinction also became important when Gertrude attempted to explain Sylvia's death by blaming a group of young men outside the household. She produced a note purportedly written by Sylvia to support that explanation. But the physical evidence did not fit the story. The injuries at different stages and the severe malnutrition pointed toward prolonged mistreatment, rather than one isolated assault. Investigators consequently turned toward the people who had been around Sylvia during those final months. Jenny Likens became a critical witness. After Sylvia's death, Jenny approached police and gave information while insisting that she be removed from the house immediately. Her account helped break through the initial explanation and identify people connected to the abuse. From there, The investigation developed into arrests, indictments, and eventually the 1966 trial. Gertrude was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Paula received a life sentence after being convicted of second-degree murder. John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard were convicted of manslaughter and received sentences ranging from 2 to 21 years. Gertrude's case then continued through the appeals process. In 1970, the Indiana Supreme Court reversed her original conviction and ordered a new trial because of issues concerning the trial process and jury selection. The reversal did not mean that Gertrude had been declared innocent. It meant that the original conviction could not stand and that the case had to be tried again. In 1971, she was once again convicted of first-degree murder. The second conviction restored the judgment against her and returned the case to the path of imprisonment. Yet even that did not represent the final public controversy surrounding Sylvia's death. In 1985, Gertrude was granted parole after nearly 2 decades in prison. More than 40,000 signatures were collected on a petition opposing her release. The reaction showed that the case had remained deeply present in public memory. The passage of time had not made the circumstances of Sylvia's death easier for people to accept. After her release, Gertrude left Indiana and lived in Iowa under another name. She died there on June 16, 1990, at 60 years of age, from lung cancer. Her death closed the life of the woman who had been the central defendant, but it did not close Sylvia's story. If anything, the later history of the case reinforced the distinction between legal closure and human closure. A sentence can end. A defendant can leave prison. A criminal proceeding can conclude. None of those things can restore a life that was lost. Sylvia's family could not receive another version of October 1965 in which she survived. Jenny could not return to the moment before her sister entered the Banaszewski home. The people who had participated in the abuse could not undo what had already happened. And the people who knew something was wrong outside the immediate household could not go back and intervene at the moment when intervention might have mattered most. The role of the surrounding community became one of the enduring questions of the case. The Banaszewski home was not isolated. Other children were around the residence. Some neighbors knew Sylvia was being treated badly. There were screams. Yet no intervention came in time to save her. It would be inappropriate to assign motives or knowledge beyond what the available information establishes. But the existence of warning signs raises an unavoidable question about responsibility. When a child cannot safely protect herself, who must act when the adults around her fail? The case contributed to a broader discussion in Indiana about child abuse and the responsibility to report it. According to the information provided, a 2024 account citing Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center described the case as contributing to Indiana's development of requirements that people who know about child abuse report it. The significance of that principle is not complicated. Children can be isolated. They can be frightened. They can depend completely on adults for access to food, school, transportation, and contact with the outside world. If the adults responsible for them become the source of danger, someone else may have to recognize the warning signs and intervene. Sylvia's case demonstrated the consequences of failing to do so. But there is another reason Sylvia's story deserves to be remembered carefully. True crime can easily turn a victim into a collection of injuries, dates, and courtroom facts. Sylvia should not be reduced to those things. Before she became the center of a murder investigation, she was a 16-year-old girl. She had a sister. She had parents. She had a life that was supposed to continue. Her identity existed before the abuse. And the fact that her final months were defined by suffering should not erase everything that came before them. The most important way to understand the case is therefore not to ask only how terrible the crime was, but to recognize the person whose life was taken. Sylvia was placed in the Banaszewski home because her family believed she would be cared for. The responsibility entrusted to Gertrude was straightforward: protect the children. Instead, Sylvia became increasingly isolated, increasingly vulnerable. and increasingly unable to escape the environment around her. Her death was the final consequence of that failure. The legal system eventually held several people accountable, but accountability came only after Sylvia could no longer benefit from it. Her story therefore leaves behind a warning that is broader than the details of one criminal case. Abuse does not always begin with the most extreme act. It can begin with something that appears smaller: anger, humiliation, punishment, isolation, or the decision to ignore a warning sign. In Sylvia's case, those elements accumulated over time. Each stage created another opportunity for someone to recognize that something was terribly wrong. By October 26, 1965, those opportunities had passed. Sylvia Likens was dead. The convictions that followed established responsibility, but they could not restore her life. Her legacy lies instead in the questions the case continues to force people to confront. What does it mean to entrust a child to another adult? What responsibility belongs to those who witness abuse? And how quickly must someone act when a child is in danger? Sylvia's story remains disturbing not simply because of the violence that ended her life, but because she spent her final months in a place where she was supposed to be safe. That is the central tragedy. She did not need extraordinary protection. She needed ordinary care. She needed someone to recognize her suffering and stop it. She needed the adults around her to fulfill the responsibility that had been placed in their hands. They failed. And by remembering Sylvia not merely as the victim of a notorious crime, but as the 16-year-old girl whose life should have continued, the story becomes more than a record of what happened in one Indianapolis house in 1965. It becomes a reminder that the responsibility to protect vulnerable children cannot end with the person who has been given formal custody. Sometimes the most important intervention comes from someone who simply notices, believes what they see, and refuses to remain silent. The story of Sylvia Likens remains difficult to confront because its most disturbing element is not simply the violence that occurred, but the length of time over which that violence was allowed to continue. Sylvia did not die in an isolated moment of danger. Her death came after weeks in which her freedom, health, and ability to protect herself had progressively disappeared. The house on East New York Street had been intended to be a temporary home for Sylvia and her sister, Jenny, while their parents were away. Instead, it became the setting for one of the most notorious child murder cases in Indiana. Understanding the significance of the case requires looking beyond the final day and examining the chain of circumstances that preceded it. Sylvia Marie Likens was born on January 3, 1949, in Lebanon, Indiana. By the summer of 1965, she was 16 years old. Her younger sister, Jenny, was 15. Their parents, Lester and Betty Likens, worked in connection with traveling fairs, a lifestyle that required frequent movement and periods of absence. Because of that work, the sisters were placed in the care of Gertrude Banaszewski, a divorced mother living in Indianapolis with several children. The arrangement was based on weekly payments from the Likens family. It was supposed to provide the girls with a stable place to stay while their parents were away. At first, nothing about the arrangement suggested the tragedy that would follow. But financial tensions soon became a significant source of conflict. The payments did not always arrive as expected, and Gertrude's frustration increased. The case information describes Gertrude as already facing difficult circumstances, including responsibility for several children and poor health. Those circumstances may explain the existence of stress within the household, but they do not explain or justify what happened to Sylvia. The violence that followed became far more severe than any disagreement about money. Sylvia began receiving physical punishment, and she gradually became a particular target. Accusations concerning her sexual and moral behavior circulated within the household. The information available in the case indicates that these accusations had no credible foundation. Nevertheless, they became part of the environment in which Sylvia was treated as someone who deserved punishment. The transformation was gradual but profound. Sylvia's normal life was taken away piece by piece. She was beaten for reasons that could be extremely minor. She was eventually prohibited from attending school. She was kept inside the house and later confined in the basement area. Her connection to people outside the household became increasingly limited. At the same time, the number of people involved in her mistreatment increased. Paula Banaszewski, Gertrude's daughter, became involved. So did John Banaszewski Jr. Two 15-year-old neighborhood boys, Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard, were also later prosecuted. Stephanie Banaszewski, another of Gertrude's children, was arrested but ultimately cooperated with prosecutors and became a witness. This collective involvement is one of the defining features of the case. Sylvia was not simply facing one person in a private conflict. Several people became participants in an environment in which violence and humiliation were directed toward her. The supplied information does not provide a complete account of every individual's private thoughts or motivations, and those details should not be invented. What is established is that Sylvia's abuse became increasingly severe and involved multiple people. She was repeatedly beaten, deprived of adequate food and water, humiliated, injured, and isolated. Her physical condition deteriorated dramatically. The injuries discovered after her death existed at different stages, providing evidence that the harm had accumulated over time. Her severe malnutrition provided another indication that she had been deprived for an extended period. This evidence would become central to the investigation because it contradicted any suggestion that Sylvia's death resulted from one sudden confrontation. Her body recorded a history of suffering. On October 26, 1965, that history ended in death. Sylvia died inside the Banaszewski home. She was 16 years old. When police arrived, they found her body in an upstairs bedroom. The medical examination identified the principal cause of death as a subdural hematoma caused by a blow to the head. Combined with shock and severe malnutrition, the findings immediately created a problem for Gertrude's explanation. She told police that Sylvia had been attacked by a group of young men. She also produced a note purportedly written by Sylvia that was intended to support the story that she had encountered danger outside the house. But the physical evidence pointed in another direction. The injuries were not consistent with a single attack. Older and newer injuries demonstrated a prolonged pattern. The severe malnutrition presented an additional contradiction. Investigators, therefore, began looking at the people who had been around Sylvia during the period in which her condition had deteriorated. The investigation moved inward toward the household. Jenny Likens became an essential part of that process. After police arrived, she approached them and gave information with one immediate condition. She wanted to be removed from the house. Her account helped investigators challenge Gertrude's initial explanation and identify people connected to Sylvia's abuse. Jenny had lived in the same environment and had been present during the period when Sylvia was increasingly isolated and mistreated. Her testimony therefore provided an important connection between the condition of Sylvia's body and the events inside the house. The arrests that followed demonstrated how far the investigation had expanded. Gertrude Banaszewski was charged with first-degree murder. Paula Banaszewski was charged with second-degree murder. John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard faced manslaughter charges. Other children connected to the household were treated as witnesses, and Gertrude's younger children were removed from the home and placed with adoptive families or care institutions. By the end of December 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury had indicted Gertrude and other participants on charges including first-degree murder. The case then entered the courtroom. The 1966 trial forced the legal system to confront an unusually complicated question. How should responsibility be divided among an adult caretaker, her children, and neighborhood teenagers? The defendants did not occupy identical positions. Gertrude was the adult responsible for Sylvia's care. Paula and John were her children. Hobbs and Hubbard were 15-year-old neighborhood boys. The law would therefore have to distinguish between their individual circumstances and roles. Gertrude denied the charges and relied on a defense that she suffered from mental illness. The jury did not accept that defense. On May 19, 1966, Gertrude was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Paula was convicted of second-degree murder and also received a life sentence. John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard were convicted of manslaughter and received sentences ranging from 2 to 21 years. The verdicts represented a formal recognition of responsibility for Sylvia's death. But Gertrude's legal battle did not end there. She appealed, and in 1970 the Indiana Supreme Court reversed the original conviction and ordered a new trial. The decision concerned issues involving the trial process and jury selection. It did not mean that Gertrude had been declared innocent. It meant that the original conviction could not remain in place and that the case had to be tried. Again, in 1971, Gertrude was once more convicted of first-degree murder. Her second conviction restored the legal judgment against her. She remained in prison for years afterward, but the eventual history of her sentence would become another source of public controversy. In 1985, after nearly 2 decades in prison, Gertrude was granted parole. More than 40,000 signatures were collected on a petition opposing her release. The reaction demonstrated that Sylvia's case had not faded from public memory. For many people, the idea of Gertrude leaving prison was difficult to accept because Sylvia had been a 16-year-old girl placed in her care. Gertrude subsequently left Indiana and lived in Iowa under another name. She died there on June 16, 1990, at the age of 60, from lung cancer. Her death closed the personal history of the principal defendant, but it did not erase the larger questions raised by the case. One of those questions concerns the people who knew that Sylvia was being mistreated. The Banaszewski home was not isolated. Other children were around the residence. Some neighbors knew that Sylvia was being treated badly. There were screams, yet no intervention came early enough to save her. The available information does not establish exactly what each person knew or why each person failed to act. And those gaps should not be filled with assumptions. But the broader reality remains significant. Sylvia's suffering was not entirely invisible. The case, therefore, became part of a wider discussion about the responsibility of communities to recognize and report child abuse. The information provided notes that a 2024 account citing Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center connected the case to Indiana's development of requirements for people who know about child abuse to report it. Such changes cannot undo Sylvia's death, but they reflect one of the lessons drawn from the tragedy. A child who is being harmed may not be capable of escaping independently. If the adults responsible for the child become the source of danger, someone else must be willing to recognize the warning signs and act. Sylvia's case illustrates what can happen when those opportunities are missed repeatedly. Her story also requires care in how it is remembered. The violence is so extreme that it can overwhelm the person at the center of the story. Sylvia can easily become a name associated only with a notorious crime. But she was more than the circumstances of her death. She was a 16-year-old daughter and sister. She entered the Banaszewski home because her family believed that an adult would care for her. Her life should have continued beyond 1965. The fact that it did not is the central tragedy. The criminal convictions that followed were important, but they came after the irreversible loss had already occurred. A courtroom could determine guilt. It could impose punishment. It could record evidence and testimony, but it could not return Sylvia to Jenny, Lester, or Betty. It could not give her back the years that had been taken from her. That is why the case remains more than a historical murder prosecution. It is also a reminder of the importance of recognizing abuse before it reaches its final consequence. Sylvia's suffering developed over time. The process moved from financial conflict to punishment, from punishment to isolation, from isolation to severe deprivation and collective abuse, and finally to death. At each stage, the situation became more dangerous. The tragedy was not simply that Sylvia died on October 26, 1965. It was that she suffered for weeks before that day in a place where she was supposed to be protected. Her story, therefore, leaves behind a responsibility for those who remember it. The purpose of revisiting the case should not be to glorify the people who committed the abuse or to turn Sylvia's suffering into spectacle. It should be to remember the victim, understand the failures that surrounded her, and recognize the importance of intervention when a vulnerable child is being harmed. Sylvia's life was short, but her story continues to carry that warning. A child does not need extraordinary circumstances to deserve protection. She needs adults who take responsibility seriously, people who listen when something is wrong, and a community willing to act before suffering becomes irreversible. In Sylvia Likens' case, those protections failed. The record that remains is therefore not only a history of a crime. It is a reminder of what can happen when abuse is allowed to become normal, when isolation prevents outside help, and when warning signs are seen but not acted upon. Sylvia was 16 years old when she died. That should never become just another number in a case file. It should remain the measure of what was lost. There is a point in every criminal case when the evidence becomes a record. The verdict becomes a legal fact, and the people involved begin to move into the past. But some cases resist becoming simply history. The death of Sylvia Likens is one of them. Decades after the events of 1965, the case continues to be remembered because it raises questions that cannot be answered by a conviction alone. The courts determined that Gertrude Banaszewski was guilty of first-degree murder. They also determined the criminal responsibility of Paula Banaszewski, John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard. But the existence of those convictions does not explain how a 16-year-old girl could spend her final months in a house where she was supposed to be protected while her suffering became increasingly severe. To understand the lasting significance of Sylvia's story, it is necessary to return to the basic arrangement that brought her into that house. Sylvia Marie Likens was born on January 3, 1949, in Lebanon, Indiana. In 1965, she was 16 years old, and her sister Jenny was 15. Their parents, Lester and Betty Likens, worked in connection with traveling fairs and frequently had to move. Because of that lifestyle, they arranged for their daughters to stay with Gertrude Banaszewski in Indianapolis while they were away. Gertrude was a divorced mother raising several children. The agreement was based on weekly payments from the Likens family. It was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to be ordinary. Most importantly, it was supposed to be safe. Instead, the relationship inside the house deteriorated. The payments from the Likens family became irregular, creating tension between Gertrude and the girls. Financial frustration was followed by punishment, and then by increasingly serious abuse. Sylvia became the principal target. Accusations about her behavior became part of the justification used against her, including accusations concerning her sexual and moral conduct that, according to the information available in the case, had no credible foundation. Whatever the original source of those accusations, they helped create a situation in which Sylvia was treated as someone who could be punished rather than protected. Her life outside the house gradually disappeared. She was no longer allowed to attend school. She was kept inside. Eventually, she was confined in the basement area. Her access to normal contact with the outside world was increasingly restricted at the same time that the violence against her became more severe. This isolation is essential to understanding the final months of her life. Sylvia was not simply subjected to individual acts of violence. She was placed in an environment where the people around her increasingly controlled her movements and access to ordinary forms of assistance. The abuse also spread to others. Paula Banaszewski and John Banaszewski Jr., Gertrude's children, became involved. Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard, both 15-year-old boys from the neighborhood, also participated and were later prosecuted. Stephanie Banaszewski was arrested but later cooperated with prosecutors and became a witness. The involvement of multiple people transformed the nature of the case. It was no longer simply a question of one adult abusing a child. It became a case in which a group of people became connected to the prolonged mistreatment of a vulnerable teenager. The information available does not establish every individual's private motivation, and those gaps should not be filled with speculation. What is known is that Sylvia was repeatedly beaten, deprived of food and water, humiliated, injured, and isolated. Her physical condition deteriorated until she was severely malnourished and suffering from numerous injuries. The medical evidence became one of the most important parts of the investigation because the injuries were at different stages. They showed that the violence had accumulated over time. Sylvia's death on October 26, 1965, therefore could not reasonably be understood as a single isolated event. The official cause of death was a subdural hematoma caused by a blow to the head, together with shock and severe malnutrition. When police arrived, Gertrude attempted to provide another explanation. She said that Sylvia had been attacked by a group of young men. She also produced a note purportedly written by Sylvia that was intended to support the story. But the evidence did not fit that account. The physical condition of Sylvia's body demonstrated a prolonged pattern of harm. Investigators began looking closely at the people who had been living around her during those final months. Jenny Likens became especially important. After Sylvia's death, Jenny approached police and gave information while insisting that she be taken out of the house immediately. Her account helped investigators move beyond Gertrude's initial explanation and identify people who had participated in the abuse. The investigation eventually led to the arrest and prosecution of Gertrude and several others. By the end of December 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury had indicted Gertrude and other participants on charges including first-degree murder. The trial began in 1966. Gertrude denied the charges and presented a defense based on mental illness. The jury rejected that defense. On May 19, 1966, Gertrude was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Paula was convicted of second-degree murder and also received a life sentence. John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard were convicted of manslaughter and received sentences ranging from 2 to 21 years. The verdicts established criminal responsibility, but they did not end Gertrude's legal case. She appealed, and in 1970 the Indiana Supreme Court reversed her original conviction and ordered a new trial because of issues concerning the trial process and jury selection. The reversal was not a declaration of innocence. It required the case to be tried again. In 1971, Gertrude was once again convicted of first-degree murder. Her second conviction restored the judgment against her. She remained in prison for nearly 2 decades before receiving parole in 1985. That decision produced a powerful public reaction. More than 40,000 signatures were collected on a petition opposing her release. The response demonstrated that Sylvia's death had remained deeply present in public memory. The controversy surrounding the parole was not simply about an old conviction. It reflected the continuing significance of the relationship between Sylvia and Gertrude. Gertrude had been the adult responsible for Sylvia's care. Sylvia had entered the household because her parents believed that she would be safe there. Her death, therefore, represented a profound betrayal of that responsibility. After her release, Gertrude left Indiana and lived in Iowa under another name. She died on June 16, 1990, at the age of 60 from lung cancer. Yet even after her death, the questions surrounding Sylvia's case remained. One of the most difficult involved the people outside the immediate household. The Banaszewski home was not isolated. Other children were around the residence, and some neighbors knew that Sylvia was being treated badly. There were screams, yet no intervention came soon enough. It is important not to invent knowledge or motives that the available evidence does not establish. We cannot responsibly say that every person who lived nearby understood the full extent of Sylvia's suffering. But the fact that people knew she was being mistreated remained significant. The case therefore became connected to a larger discussion about the responsibility to report child Abuse. The information provided notes that a 2024 account citing Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center described. The case is contributing to Indiana's development of requirements for people who know about child abuse to report it. Such changes cannot undo the past. They cannot restore Sylvia's life. But they represent one way society can respond to a tragedy by attempting to reduce the possibility that similar warning signs will be ignored in the future. Sylvia's story also demonstrates why child protection cannot depend entirely on the person who has formal custody. A child may be unable to leave. A child may be isolated from school and friends. A child may be dependent upon adults for food, transportation, communication, and access to help. If the person responsible for that child becomes the source of danger, the child may have very few ways to escape. In Sylvia's case, her isolation became part of the mechanism that allowed the abuse to continue. The final lesson of the case is therefore not simply that several people were punished. It is that intervention matters before a crime reaches its final stage. Sylvia's suffering developed gradually. The circumstances changed from financial tension to physical punishment, from punishment to isolation, from isolation to deprivation and collective abuse, and finally to death. That progression means there were stages at which the situation was already dangerous, but had not yet reached its final consequence. Remembering those stages matters because it prevents the case from being reduced to the moment of Sylvia's death. Her death was the endpoint of a longer process. Sylvia should also not be remembered only through the injuries documented after her death. She was a daughter, a sister, and a 16-year-old girl whose life should have continued. Her sister, Jenny, survived, and her parents were left with the loss of a daughter. Nothing about the legal process could restore the years that Sylvia would otherwise have lived. A conviction could establish responsibility, but it could not reverse the consequences. A prison sentence could punish an offender, but it could not give Sylvia another chance at life. Even Gertrude's later death could not provide a final answer to every question the case raised. The enduring importance of Sylvia's story lies in the fact that it forces attention away from the spectacle of the crime and back toward the responsibility that preceded it. She was entrusted to an adult. That adult failed to protect her. Other people became involved in the abuse. People outside the household were aware that she was being mistreated. And despite all of those opportunities for intervention, Sylvia died. The most responsible way to remember such a case is not to romanticize the perpetrators or to make their cruelty the center of the story. It is to keep the victim at the center. Sylvia was 16 years old. She had entered the Banaszewski home expecting temporary care and never returned to her family alive. Her name became attached to one of the most notorious criminal cases in Indiana, but her identity should never be reduced to the crime itself. The facts of her final months are disturbing because they reveal prolonged suffering, but they are also important because they demonstrate why warning signs must be taken seriously. The history of the case ultimately leaves one enduring principle. When a vulnerable child is being harmed, silence can have consequences that cannot be undone. Sylvia's death cannot be changed. The verdicts cannot change it. The appeals cannot change it. Gertrude's parole cannot change it. Her death in 1990 cannot change it. What can change is how the story is remembered and what society chooses to learn from it. Sylvia Likens was 16 years old when she died. The most important fact is not the notoriety that followed her death, but the life that should have continued after it. Remembering her means recognizing what was lost, understanding how the warning signs accumulated, and refusing to let the passage of time make that loss less significant. The case of Sylvia Likens has endured for decades because its meaning reaches beyond the dates of the arrests, the courtroom verdicts, and the eventual death of the woman who was convicted of killing her. Sylvia's story remains a record of what can happen when a child is placed in the care of an adult, and that responsibility is abandoned. It is also a story about escalation. Nothing about the final condition of Sylvia's body can be understood by looking only at October 26, 1965. Her death was the consequence of a period of abuse that developed over time, beginning with circumstances that were initially ordinary and becoming increasingly severe until she was no longer able to protect herself. Sylvia Marie Likens was 16 years old when she died. She had been born on January 3, 1949, in Lebanon, Indiana. Her sister Jenny was 15. Their parents, Lester and Betty Likens, worked in connection with traveling fairs, and their work required them to move frequently. In the summer of 1965, they arranged for Sylvia and Jenny to stay with Gertrude Banaszewski in Indianapolis while they were away. Gertrude was a divorced mother raising several children. The arrangement was based on weekly payments from the Likens family. It was a practical solution to a family circumstance. There was an expectation that Gertrude would care for the girls until their parents returned. Sylvia should have been able to attend school, eat regularly, remain connected to her family, and live without fear. Instead, the relationship inside the Banaszewski home deteriorated. Payments from the Likens family became irregular, and the resulting financial tension became part of the conflict. Gertrude was already responsible for several children and was described in the supplied information as having health and financial difficulties, but those circumstances cannot explain away what followed. The abuse became increasingly directed towards Sylvia. She was beaten for reasons that became progressively more arbitrary. Accusations about her behavior and morality were made, including allegations concerning sexual conduct that had no credible foundation according to the information available. Those accusations became part of the environment in which Sylvia was treated as though she were deserving of punishment. The distinction between punishment and abuse eventually disappeared completely. Sylvia's freedom was restricted. She was no longer permitted to attend school. She was kept inside the house and eventually confined in the basement area. Her access to the world outside the Banaszewski household became increasingly limited. That isolation mattered because it reduced the opportunities for someone else to recognize how serious her condition had become. At the same time, the abuse expanded beyond Gertrude. Paula Banaszewski and John Banaszewski Jr., Gertrude's children, became involved. Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard, both 15-year-old boys from the neighborhood, were also involved and later prosecuted. Stephanie Banaszewski was arrested, but eventually cooperated with prosecutors and testified. The case therefore became one of collective abuse rather than an isolated act by one person. Several people were connected to the mistreatment of Sylvia, and the violence became increasingly normalized within the environment where she was trapped. The information available does not provide enough evidence to describe the private thoughts of each participant, and there is no responsible reason to invent them. What can be stated clearly is the pattern of events. Sylvia was repeatedly beaten, deprived of food and water, humiliated, injured, and isolated. Her condition deteriorated severely. When she was eventually examined after death, investigators found numerous injuries at different stages. That detail was crucial. It indicated that the injuries had accumulated over time. Sylvia had not simply suffered one fatal assault. Her body showed evidence of prolonged mistreatment. She was also severely malnourished, another indication that the abuse had continued for an extended period. On October 26, 1965, Sylvia died at the Banaszewski home. She was found in an upstairs bedroom. The official cause of death was a subdural hematoma caused by a blow to the head. Combined with shock and severe malnutrition, the circumstances immediately raised questions about what had happened inside the house. Gertrude initially attempted to provide a different explanation. She told police that Sylvia had been attacked by a group of young men. She also produced a note purportedly written by Sylvia in an effort to support the account. But the evidence did not correspond with the story. A single attack could not explain the different stages of injury or the severe malnutrition. Investigators therefore began examining the people who had been living with Sylvia and interacting with her during the period in which her condition had deteriorated. Jenny Likens became one of the most important witnesses. She approached police after Sylvia's death and provided information while insisting that she be taken out of the house immediately. Her statement helped undermine the initial account and directed investigators toward the people connected with the abuse. From there, the investigation expanded into a series of arrests. Gertrude Banaszewski was charged with first-degree murder. Paula Banaszewski faced a second-degree murder charge. John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard were charged with manslaughter. Other children connected to the household were treated as witnesses, while Gertrude's younger children were removed from the home and placed with adoptive families or care institutions. By the end of December 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury had indicted Gertrude and other participants. The following year, the case went to trial. The courtroom had to address not only the death of Sylvia, but also the different circumstances of the people accused of participating in her abuse. Gertrude was an adult and the person who had accepted responsibility for caring for Sylvia. Paula and John were her children. Hobbs and Hubbard were 15-year-old neighborhood boys. The charges and verdicts reflected those distinctions. Gertrude denied the accusations and relied on a defense based on mental illness. The jury rejected the defense. On May 19, 1966, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Paula was convicted of second-degree murder and also received a life sentence. John Banaszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard were convicted of manslaughter and received sentences ranging from 2 to 21 years. Gertrude's conviction, however, did not remain untouched. She appealed, and in 1970 the Indiana Supreme Court reversed the original conviction and ordered a new trial. The decision concerned issues involving the trial process and jury selection. It did not establish that Gertrude was innocent. Instead, it meant that the original conviction could not stand and that the case had to be tried again. In 1971, Gertrude was once again convicted of first-degree murder. The second conviction reaffirmed the legal judgment against her. She remained in prison for years afterward. Then, in 1985, after nearly 2 decades behind bars, she was granted parole. The decision produced intense public opposition. More than 40,000 signatures were collected on a petition opposing her release. That reaction demonstrated that the case remained deeply present in public memory. For many people, the idea of Gertrude leaving prison was particularly difficult because Sylvia had entered her household specifically to receive care. Gertrude had been entrusted with a responsibility toward a child, and that responsibility had been catastrophically violated. After her release, Gertrude left Indiana and lived in Iowa under another name. She died there on June 16, 1990, at the age of 60, from lung cancer. Her death ended the life of the central defendant, but it did not end the questions surrounding Sylvia. One of the most important questions concerns the people who were outside the immediate group of defendants. The Banaszewski home was not isolated. Other children were around the house, and some neighbors knew that Sylvia was being treated badly. There were screams, yet no intervention came early enough to save her. It is important to distinguish between what is known and what remains uncertain. The available information does not establish exactly what every neighbor knew, what each person believed, or why individual people failed to intervene. Those details should not be invented. But the broader fact remains: signs of mistreatment were present, and Sylvia continued to suffer. That reality became part of the case's lasting significance and its connection to discussions about child protection. According to the information provided, a 2024 account citing Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center described the case as contributing to Indiana's development of requirements for people who know about child abuse to report it. Such reporting requirements cannot undo what happened to Sylvia, but they reflect a lesson drawn from the tragedy. A child may be unable to escape an abusive environment without assistance. A child may depend upon adults for food, shelter, education, transportation, and contact with the outside world. When the adult responsible for that child becomes the source of danger, someone else may have to recognize the warning signs and act. Sylvia's situation became progressively more isolated precisely when she needed outside protection most. The case therefore illustrates the importance of intervention before abuse reaches its final stage. Her suffering did not appear suddenly on the day she died. It developed through a sequence of escalating events: financial conflict, physical punishment, accusations, isolation, deprivation, collective abuse, severe deterioration, and finally death. Each stage represented a worsening situation. By October 26th, the opportunity to prevent the final outcome had disappeared. That is one of the most painful aspects of the case. Sylvia's death was the final event, but it was not the beginning of the tragedy. She had already lost access to school. She had already been isolated. She had already suffered serious physical harm. She had already become severely malnourished. Her final day was the end point of a process that had been unfolding for weeks. For that reason, remembering Sylvia requires more than remembering the people who were convicted. It requires remembering the responsibility that existed before the crime reached the courtroom. Sylvia was a daughter. She was Jenny's sister. She was a 16-year-old girl whose future had not yet been lived. Her life should not be reduced to the circumstances of her death. The details of the case are necessary to understand the crime, but the victim must remain at the center of the story. She entered the Banaszewski home because an adult had agreed to care for her. She should have left that house alive when her parents returned. Instead, she died there. The trials that followed were necessary for accountability, but they could not restore her. The appeal could not restore her. The second conviction could not restore her. Gertrude's imprisonment could not restore her. Her parole could not change the past, and her death in 1990 could not close every question the case raised. What remains is the record of a failure that occurred at several levels. The failure of an adult caretaker to protect a child, the participation of others in her abuse, and the failure of intervention before her suffering became irreversible. Sylvia's legacy, therefore, lies not in the notoriety of the people responsible for her death, but in the importance of remembering the life they took. The most meaningful conclusion to her story is not another description of violence. It is the recognition that she was 16, that she had a family waiting for her, and that she should have had decades ahead of her. Her story remains a warning about what happens when a vulnerable child is isolated and when abuse is allowed to continue without effective intervention. The legal record tells us who was convicted. The historical record tells us when events happened. But Sylvia's humanity reminds us why the case still matters. She was a young person who was entrusted to the care of an adult and who never came home. Everything that followed began with that loss.